Dragonflight is arriving, changes are here and coming. The question is, do Warlocks stand a chance? Will we continue to reign? Or will we be left in the dust? Well, this video is going to be looking at the raid profile side of things. What do our damage profiles look like? We're going to take a loose look at the numbers on these graphs and kind of see where things are trending and how our specs can look. Obviously, we don't want to look too much at the numbers directly because they are subject to change, but we will be referencing them here and there in the graphs to give some semblance of kind of how things are going to be looking and give us a base understanding of where the specs sit in relation to what we're currently playing and what we know. So with that in place, let's start with Affliction and go into the single target profiles. So on screen, you will see two log charts. The top one is for Shadowlands and the one underneath is for Dragonflight single target. Now, fight length is a little bit different. Unfortunately, it was a pain to try and get everything to match up, but we can still see a good trend line and how things have changed. So one of the first things to take away is how the spec itself is changing with the introduction of the talent trees, where the emphasis in our damage is coming from, and how that impacts. So in Shadowlands at the moment, Affliction is very much a cooldown reliant class, or spec, in that quite a lot of it focuses around the use of Dark Glare, Phantom Singularity, Raptures, Soul Rot, or in the case of Necrolords, making use of Decimating Bolt. Now, that's perfectly fine, but by being cooldown reliant, it means that we are very limited in our profile. You can see that it's very spiky with a very low damage floor. And by damage floor, I mean what your average is if you don't have anything ticking over. So, just your dots, the odd Malefic Rapture to make sure that you don't shard spend or shard cap, and just keeping everything ticking over. One of the big changes going from Shadowlands to Dragonflight across all three specs is the fact that our damage floor is higher. Part of that will be due to gear, but another part of it is also how the spec is being played, the talents you have access to, and just generally how things are synergizing. Because we have to bear in mind, the talent sets that are being implemented for Season 1 are all very basic and very much learning your class focus. They don't really do a lot. For example, Affliction's 2 set, when you generate a shard, you have a chance to gain a buff that gives you 12% haste. Now, that 12% haste isn't going to break anything. It's not going to break the bank, but it's nice. Because obviously that little bit of extra haste is nice, but it's on a proc. It's based when Agony creates or generates a shard for you. Alternatively, you have Destructions, which just increases your crit chance for a period of time. And then the 4 set for Destruction on top of that increases the crit damage you do. It was previously the fact that your crits had a chance to do AoE damage, but Blizzard have since changed that, so in a future patch or future cycle of the beta, we'll be able to test the crit damage scaling multiplier, so rather than 200%, it'll be 208, something that they can further tweak, but it's passive. Demonology, the same boat. So as a result, this is more about learning how the specs are, the changes to the specs, and generally how things have improved. And the biggest thing for Affliction is the move away from cooldowns. You can see that we still have peaks within our graph, but notice how they're a lot gentler and they span a longer time period, where they then dip back down. Say at this 2-minute mark, you see a climb at 1:45 to 2 minutes, and then you see a gradual decline into the 2:10 mark, and then a climb back up again towards the 2:30 mark. And this is because Affliction's emphasis is back on dot damage. Agony does more damage, Siphon Life, Corruption. You can augment the damage of your Corruption. You can speed up the tick rate of your dots so that they're ticking 15% faster. So over the course of a fight, a lot more of your damage comes through as actual dot damage, rather than relying on this 40% Malefic Rapture damage and Drain Soul, which is really, really nice, and it smooths out our damage. The only problem, and the downside to this, as you will see when we start getting into things like the AoE component for Affliction, is it means that your ceiling, like this top spike of damage, is much harder to pull off, especially in a raiding environment. I am also releasing a video that covers this over the Mythic Plus side. It is a shorter video, so by all means, go watch that. I will put a link at the end of the video and obviously in the description below so that you guys can bounce between the two and enjoy them at your leisure. But from a raiding perspective, Affliction's ceiling is lower than Demonology's or Destruction's. But we'll get into that as we talk about the other two specs as well. So, what are the first things we can take away at an initial glance then for single target Affliction? Well, first off, the initial spike damage will be higher, as you can see. For Shadowlands Affliction, it peaked at 45k, 50k in the execution range with being a Necrolord outside of Bloodlust. However, for Dragonflight, you're looking at peaking upwards of 80k damage quite comfortably during a Bloodlust. And also, interesting fact about it being Affliction as well, is traditionally Affliction requires ramp time because you need agony. However, there are talents within place that could accelerate this, or quite simply, because you're increasing the tick rate of agony, it's stacking faster anyway, which means that whereas Affliction traditionally has quite a long burst window, so say for instance, this peak might be 15 seconds into the fight, we're actually hitting our peak damage very, very rapidly into the 10 to 15 second mark. So we have a much steeper acceleration thanks to the speed at which we're ramping and the fact that our dots are doing the bulk of our damage. So what is actually our delaying factor here is how quickly we can get our dots applied. And there will obviously be a limitation to that because of the global cooldown. But this will emphasize precasting things like precasting UA or precasting a Haunt. And this kind of thing within a raid setting will be the benefit between much faster bursts and lesser bursts, depending on where you want to set your Bloodlust. But you can see throughout the rest of the fight as well, and a really good example of the damage floor being so much higher is for Dragonflight. If you look from the 3-minute mark, just here, through to the 4-minute mark, I apologize if my mouse looks quite small on your screen, but you can see that there's a pretty stable line with a couple of dips. This could be a dot dropping where you didn't mean it to, the boss being out of range, or whatever, but you can see that the damage is just much higher and consistent, which is really, really nice to see, as opposed to Shadowlands' spiky, you know, every time you've got Phantom Singularity, great, we're about to do some damage. But if you die, like just before a Phantom Singularity or just after, you can't really do much. A really bad situation for Shadowlands at the moment is you get everything set up, you're about to go for a really big Drain Soul if you're running Necrolord, and then all of a sudden you've got to move. Because the mechanics require you to move to soak something, or you're about to explode and you need to get away from the group. And it's really, really nasty and punishing. On the vein of punishing, we'll talk about Demonology, because Demonology is very much in the same boat. Demonology in Shadowlands, as a lot of you know, plays around Tyrant, and your damage is very much tied to your Tyrant. I've released videos in the past, both from a Mythic Plus and a rating perspective, where something's gone wrong during my Tyrant setup. Whether it's been I've been so focused on my setup I've been killed by something because I was a moron, and you know, Blizzard circles are always bigger than they actually appear, to just timing it a second or two out because I've been focusing on a mechanic, and as a result I've lost a few imps. And in the Shadowlands setting, that is really punishing, partially due to things like Decon, which is being removed in Dragonflight and we're being given something else instead. Tyranny acts similar, but we'll discuss that in a moment. But so much emphasis is on Tyrant damage, especially in single target for Demonology, that as you can see, there's these huge discrepancies between having a Tyrant and not having a Tyrant. So much so that, again, the damage floor of your class when you're just like playing through your rotation with no cooldowns available is so much lower, like factor of like a fifth of your damage in comparison. Whereas going into Dragonflight, because of the changes to the spec as a whole, the fact that we have the dogs baseline, our Fel guards can amplify the damage of our pets, we can increase the damage of our Dreadstalkers, we can have more imps, we can have a menagerie of demons out with us at all times. It's really smoothed some of our damage out. Yes, there are still the big spikes where your Tyrant's concerned, because end of the day, Tyrant is like the signature spell for Demonology. But the change from Decon to Tyranny means that we're no longer worried about stamina scaling. And this is partially due to the fact that we were getting Soulburn back, and Soulburn paired with a Health Stone would have given us more health. And obviously, at the start of beta, that was a huge no-no with Decon, because it meant that you were effectively popping your Health Stone offensively, because the more health you have, the more health your demons have. The more health your demons have, the more health is taken by your Tyrant when it's summoned. Tyranny, on the other hand, negates the whole stamina side of things, and instead just allocates a percentage of damage increase per imp, pet, demon you summon. Now, I don't know if this is a bug or not. I've not actually been able to find anything, but it looks like Tyranny at the moment actually continues to stack and gets stronger throughout the fight. The stacks don't reset. So, as long as you're summoning pets consistently, the damage percentage increases. So your last Tyrant will be your strongest Tyrant in a fight. Now, I suspect that that is actually a bug, whether it be a UI error on my part, or just something that hasn't quite been fixed yet, is yet to be determined. But I suspect that is going to be the case, and obviously every Tyrant will do roughly the same amount of damage, and it'll be a skill thing between, or gear, potentially, on haste, how many pets you've had out, how many, dogs have you summoned, your Grima Felguard, and general allocation of demons, like maybe Nether Portal might actually be useful in this setting, or you might actually prefer to go the other way and just buff the ever-living hell out of your Felguard, so your Felguard does a lot more damage. My point is, though, Tyranny is a lot more sustainable, I guess, but Tyranny also has the choice of Wilfrids. So what you can do as Demonology is, although Tyrant does a big portion of our damage, Demonology has the ability to change its damage profile slightly. So obviously at the moment we're very accustomed to having our 1 minute Tyrant lining up with Solros and being able to do huge amounts of damage every minute, partially due to Decon. Now, the Demonology profile, as you can see, it does still have these spikes, a couple of peaks and troughs, and is generally a little bit spikier in places. These spikier placements can be crits, pet summonings, and just generally like Fellstorm, Demonic Strength, Soul Strike, depending on the build you're running. But the overarching theme of this is you're going to be able to have either a 1.5 minute Tyrant build, which will desync from something like Grimoire Felguard, which is a 2 minute cooldown, as well as Racials, which means that you're going to be lining up essentially every third one, because it'll be 0, 2, 4, 6, and then you'll have 0, 130, 3, 430, 6, which might be a really, really nice to play. It means you've got multiple cooldowns and you can roll them. Alternatively, if you go for the minute cooldown, you can play a similar build now, but it means that your peaks won't be as high. Like, you might not hit the 75k that you see. Instead, you might only be hitting, say, 60, 55 at the most, or at the lower end of it. But it means that from a raiding perspective, you're going to be able to have something every minute. And you're going to go with almost like the old Red Paladin and current Demo Warlock, where you've got big burst, little burst, cardboard box type setting, which will be really, really nice, especially if you're a raider, because it'll enable you to play around with certain fights. Because you've also got to bear in mind as well, Tyrant does extend, so if you've got a boss that's summoning adds every minute, and these adds can be stacked, having a minute Tyrant that you can then immediately implode into because you've just fed a boatload of imps into it, really nice. Especially with the recent change as well, so that Tyrant actually gives you 5 shards rather than the 3 that it was giving previously through most of the beta. Really, really nice. But discussing variants, a really good example of this and a really good way to show variants as a whole is if we discuss destruction. Now, obviously, destruction's a bit of an odd one, because through Season 3, Season 4 of Shadowlands, with the tier set bonus, we've kind of had this rolling, constant damage feedback loop for destruction, with the Blasphemy Infernals, Reign of Chaos, being able to generate shards out of our ass, and just be able to constantly pump damage to the point where you see this huge burst, not quite as high as Demonology in its single target form, but then it drops down, and the moment you're done, you're coming back up into your next window, because this is your, your blasphemies feeding into each other. Then you drop again, and then you're back into another blasphemy window, and then you're back into your burst, and rinse and repeat. And because you're playing kind of this constant, you've got something popping damage, it doesn't really matter that your floor is so low, because again, like, there are points that, as you can see, where your floor is, hitting 5k. Like that's your floor in Shadowlands, like 5k destruction damage. That's really not a nice place to be. Because if anything was to go wrong there, say you died and you basically had to restart from nothing, and you're going to have to then try and generate again, that's really going to hurt. And as a player, that feels bad. However, into Dragonflight, we have two main options really for single target. We have Variant 1 and Variant 2. Variant 2, this bottom graph, also utilizes Soul Flame in its damage log, whereas Variant 1 doesn't. Now, as you can see, Variant 1 is a little bit more spiky. It is using Channel Demon Fire, it's got its Blasphemy Infernals, it's got its normal Infernal, but you can see that it has its spikes, it's doing its damage, and it's doing well, because you've got to bear in mind that Reign of Chaos won't work the way it did back in Season 3 and pre-nerfs Season 4, where obviously the only Reign of Chaos benefit you get is from your main Infernal. However, you can reduce its cooldown if you really want to, so you can make it a 2-minute cooldown. Obviously, final builds and things like that will be dictated to by tuning, but at least for now, we get to play around with things and see how the graphs look. So there's every possibility you could have a 2-minute build, a 3-minute build, but then not only on top of that, you can then have this execution build. Now, I want to draw your attention, because this collection of logs was taken from the exact same encounter, 2 warlocks running the same gear and doing the same thing. But look how different their profiles look, going from the 2 minutes 45 seconds into the fight through to the 4:30 mark. Now, this top warlock, Warlock 1, running without Soulfire, still has these very clearly defined moments of spike damage. They're not huge spikes of damage, but they're still spikes of damage. Comparatively, the Soulfire Warlock actually has a slightly higher floor of total damage, and it's much steadier across the board. Again, there are a couple of spikes here and there, but these could be down to simple procs of trinkets, procs of effects, and obviously you have to bear in mind Destruction's RNG nature of its mastery as well. So a little bit of variations are fine. You're not going to have a perfectly straight line. However, the reason for this, and the reason its floor is higher but it's not peaking, is because of the way that Soulfire works. Like, Soulfire is almost like a pseudo-execute ability, in that there are talents that allow you to reduce its cooldown and increase the frequency of your use of it over the course of a fight when the target has less than 50% health. So Destruction has two ends of the spectrum in terms of damage. You have talents like Flashpoint that increase your haste when Immolate ticks on a target above 80% health. Huge haste proc, and really, really nice. But then you also have the Soulfire end of things, where when things get below 50% health, you're able to pump out more Soulfires. Now, Soulfire does a reasonable amount of damage, further amplified if you're running things like Roaring Blaze, because you remember Soulfire is fire damage, and Roaring Blaze will amplify that if you're playing that build. but it also applies Immolate and generates a Soul Shard. So you're generating shards. It's also benefited from Backdraft and hits reasonably hard. It's not Chaos Bolt levels of hard, but you can see what I'm getting from. And what a spell that is traditionally a 20-second cooldown, you can massively reduce it to the point where you're casting it frequently. So for this Warlock number 2, this bottom graph, this blue, this dark blue, you can see at the very, very bottom of the graph, if I zoom in slightly, zoom, 125, scroll down, you can see just below these dark blue trapeziums, I believe they're called, off the top of my head. I was naff with shapes, so don't quote me on that. But you can see the difference in damage and the frequency at which they come in. So at the start of the fight, you've got it cast at, 16, 17 seconds, and then it does a period of damage, drops off at around the 30. You then have its initial cooldown period, where it then comes in again at 110, spanning over 115, and drops at probably about 120. You then have it at the 2-minute mark, and this will be where the execution period starts, because all of a sudden you've then got it again at 2:30, 3 minutes, just after 3:30. You then have less than 15 seconds from it expiring, just gone past the 3-minute 45-second mark, to then bang on 4 minutes, drops again just before 4:15, and you've got it again less than 10 seconds later. And that pushes your damage during the execute phase just that little bit. So depending on how fights are tuned, if you're in a raid setting and all of a sudden you need that little bit more execute damage, you might actually see your Warlocks decide to go Destruction for this, to play Soulfire, whereas traditionally they might have been Demonology, perhaps, and had a damage profile more akin to this, or even maybe Affliction. Because obviously, taking number tuning aside, the specs are all fairly on par with each other, and I discussed this in the Mythic Plus video where I also discussed the specs, but they're kind of all in the same ballpark, generally. And as things look currently, it's going to be that your deciding factors on which spec to play are not only going to be what specs are fun for you personally. Like, I'm not the greatest Demonology fan, personally. I miss the mop era of Demonology where you had Dark Apotheosis and Metamorphosis. Obviously, that is never going to be the case again. You know, it was good while it lasted, like carrying as a Warlock in Rated Battlegrounds. But instead, we now have this menagerie build. But my favourite spec is Affliction. However, I know Warlocks in my guild really don't like Affliction. So if Affliction was to become the top dog, I'd probably be the only Warlock in my guild that enjoyed it. However, thankfully, numerically and kind of positionally, that doesn't actually seem to be the case with Warlocks. The deciding factors are going to be things like fight style, tanks. Are your tanks going to be really kitey? Or are they going to be able to make death balls? If they're going to make death balls, then Demonology and Destruction are going to be infinitely superior to Affliction. But if you have a kiting tank, where, like a Demon Hunter, for instance, that gets in, makes a death ball really quickly, applies brand to everything, Elysian Decree, does what it needs to, but then gets the hell out of dodge, you're going to have a much better time as Affliction, because you can get all your dots out, you can get everything rolling, and then if things spread apart, it doesn't matter, because you're then looking at improving your dots by maintaining them, increasing your haste, Malefic Rapture. Malefic Rapture doesn't need everything to be stacked, whereas it would if you're running seeds. That kind of thing. And that's a really, really good place for Warlocks to be. And that's further amplified when we start looking into the AoE profiles of things. So, again, starting with Affliction. We'll actually zoom out a little bit so we can get a better view of the picture. And you can already see just how different this graph looks. And now, again, there is an extra minute on this fight from Shadowlands to Dragonflight, but you can see the difference. There are these huge, very noticeable and very distinguished spikes throughout the course of the Affliction thing, and this is where it's tied up to our cooldowns. Now, having already discussed it in the single target side of things, the AoE just further kind of exaggerates just how big these are. To the point where, like, you can see that because the fight lasted so long, Bloodlust came in during the Shadowlands fight after, say, 5 minutes, and the Warlock just had nothing to go with it, to the point where it just tails off, and then you get to 5 minutes 30, and then it drops off even further, because, like, completely and utterly run out of steam. We don't have any cooldowns to go with it. We don't have Malefic Rapture, Seed of Corruption, Shards are spent, Soul Rod's done. We don't have our Vile Fiend. No, Vile Fiend. Dark Glare. Sorry. All the different demon names. My head's just gone to pot. But you get the point. We don't have Dark Glare. We don't have Vile Taint. We don't have Phantom Singularity. We don't have anything. And in Shadowlands, that is a problem. Comparatively though, and this is where I was talking about damage ceilings and damage floors, you can see that we don't have anywhere near the same spike. So Shadowlands, a good Affliction spike at the moment in a raid setting for AoE encounters, you will see something where you can get like 75k quite easily, maybe even higher if you do it during a Bloodlust. In Dragonflight, however, we don't even hit 50k in terms of a spike. Now, obviously, there are still places where this could be changed, like for instance, the player's running Phantom Singularity over Vile Taint, and Vile Taint's changed to Mass Apply Agony instead. Kind of brings you to a thing. There is also things like your Dark Glare having Grim Reach. Now, Grim Reach causes your Dark Glare to do AoE damage to everything it hits, with everything with a dot on it. So there are cases in Mythic Plus where you can hit, using the Grim Reach build, you can comfortably hit like 100k, 120, maybe even 140 if your tank's pulled right. And you can do huge amounts of damage. And that is still like your 2-minute build. So you will see these spikes during a Mythic Plus profile. But in a raid setting, you might not necessarily want to full dive into AoE. And that's where this build is holding its own. There are drops, as you can see. This could be the fact that they've let their drops, their dots drop on certain targets like Agony, which could be a practice thing, or it could simply be a fact that the mobs are out of range. You know, you're doing a mechanic. Things get out of range and you can't always extend your dots before you disappear. So that is why these dropped off. But you can see that just naturally, the average floor is considerably higher. It's almost 3 times higher than what it is in Shadowlands for Affliction Warlocks. And this is obviously only going to increase the more targets you add to something. Now, the strength of Affliction here is going to be pantheonic fights. So 3-4 targets spread and being able to just have that nice, consistent ticking damage, which is one of Affliction's strengths, and it's good to see that strength return. Comparatively, Demonology is going to be very strong for stacked AoE settings, and you can kind of see some of the key changes in the profile as well. So, Shadowlands, as we've already discussed, huge emphasis on Tyrant. Huge emphasis on Tyrant for damage. And you can see that. You see these implosions come in grey, these grey sections, or middle of the chart sections for those of you that are colorblind. And for that I do apologize that I can't make this better for you guys. But you can see that the moment you implode, huge spike of damage, pushing the rest of your damage up, and then you kind of just tail off. And it's almost like falling off a cliff. And then you're kind of waiting, you're ramping, your dogs are doing a little bit of damage, your hand will down, a couple of smaller implosions, not too bad. But again, huge discrepancy between like your 100k peak and your less than 25k floor, probably closer to 10 looking at some of these really, really low points. And translate that to Dragonflight, because the emphasis of our damage is coming from other places, and we can have Imp Gang Boss, we can have Inner Demons, we can constantly have multiple dog legendaries, Grim Inquisitors, as well as, you know, better Hand of Gul'dan's, more frequent Hand of Gul'dan's, chance for Hand of Gul'dan double casting if you really want to, improved Felguard, and the fact that your Felguard is going to increase the damage of your Imps and your Fel Hunters. Your Fel Hunters are also going to cleave damage because you're running the Dogs build, and all this sort of stuff, as well as things like the Axe Toss talent. It used to be called Hold For Me, and I think it's called Guillotine now. Off the top of my head, where your Felguard throws the weapon onto the ground and then proceeds to punch everything in an AoE vicinity around it. Huge amount of damage. Really, really nice. But flip side of that is everything needs to be stacked. And you can still see that we're having these nice spikes. There's still a point within this particular fight, at least, where as a Demonology Warlock, you can still break 100k. Comfortably. You can see here just around the 3-minute mark they managed to break that 100k cycle, but the rest of it is much lower, peaking at 75k pretty much the rest of the time, a little bit higher, but the floor is pushing 25 50k in places, so you're going to be sitting somewhere around probably the 30k mark for the majority of a fight, which is so much nicer, especially on a progression setting, because the last thing you want as a player, both from a rating perspective and as a personal perspective, I imagine for most people, obviously please do comment in below if I'm wrong and you actually prefer this much spikier build, but by having a higher floor, it's easier to understand where things can be improved on, because you know progression wise that if you can eke out an extra, say, 3k damage across the entire fight space, you're good. Whereas the difference between you pulling, say, finishing a fight on 25k and finishing a fight on 50k, in Shadowlands at least, can literally be decided on how quickly you kill a boss, or where your cooldowns line up in terms of abilities, like this Affliction Warlock being a prime example, for instance. If their party had bloodlusted 30 seconds to a minute earlier, that boss probably would have died probably a good 20 or 30 seconds earlier. And the Affliction Warlock in question would have done considerable, or it would have appeared to have done considerably more damage at the end of the fight. So, pretty nice. Now, finally getting on to Destruction, because I appreciate this is a long video, especially compared to my other one, is the variance in Destruction's AoE profiles. So, this top one is Shadowlands, and it's very much, it's Blasphemy Infernal. As you can see, you're just constantly going, and eventually, at the 5-minute mark, just ads ran out for this particular fight log, and then it kind of ramped back up during the single target. So for this case, we're just going to look at the 5 minutes onwards. So what we're going to do is just look at this section here. Now, from the 0 to 5 minute mark, you're constantly going, which is really, really nice for Blasphemy, and played really, really well. Unfortunately, though, it's a relatively boring playstyle, just constantly rain of firing and waiting for your Infernals to do the work. Now, looking at the Dragonflight variant, again, you have two different builds here. You have one that is very, very rotationally heavy, because we'll discuss the spell things, and then you've got one that is much lighter. Variant 1 has, like, all the spells going. So, Channel Demon Fire, Chaos Bolt, Conflagurate, Fell Blast, Fell Bolt, Immolate, Incinerate, Infernal Awakening, Pipad, who is the Imp, Rain of Fire, Soul Fire, and Summon Infernal. That is 12 instances of damage over the course of this log. Some of that is obviously going to be imp damage, but still, that is a considerable amount of stuff to fit into your rotation. Having Channel Fire, Channel Demon Fire, and Soul Fire, which again you can kind of see in Soul Fire for this log is in the bright green. You can see them being used in intervals. The interval for Soul Fire should be shorter once you get to this like 4-minute to 5-minute phase, as we saw in the single target log. But because there's so much going on in this log, the person's not being able to fit their Soul Fires in. Alternatively, you then have Variant 2 that is running Chaos Bolt, Conflagrate, Immolate, Incinerate, Infernal Awakening, Soul Combustion, Soul Fire, again, using Soul Fire, but you can see that theirs is purple and using theirs, so they don't have Channel Demon Fire, Soul Room, and Summon Infernal. So, less instances of damage, and you can see the difference in the profile. So much so that Variant 1 has more going for them and more things to think about and therefore worry about, but their peak damage is higher than Variant 2, who has less going on. But Variant 2 has a few extra spikes and has a higher floor in places. Now, this is, from an AoE setting for destruction, one of the things that you're going to have to bear in mind is how you want to play it, because there are certain builds around this, and we'll discuss builds when we actually have pre-patch and the release of the expansion itself, as we talk more in depth about it with numbers tuning. But depending on the AoE fight for destruction, you have like 4 or 5 different ways that you could spec, to the point where you can have Havoc, Rolling Havoc, Flashpoint, you can AoE incinerate things, you can increase Rain of Fire damage, you can increase your Immolate dots, you can have Channel Demon Fire, you can have Soul Fire, you could have, if the adds are consistently in the fight, like say the first 60% of Vigilant Guardian, as you can see here, from 0 to 5 minutes, you just have constantly rolling adds, at which point a Rain of Fire build would be really, really good. Especially with the Infernal talent, where your Rain of Fires are helping you to generate shards and you can keep rolling. And it'll play similar to our current build, except you're then weaving in things like Channel Demon Fire, ensuring Immolates are topped up. Or the adds may spawn every 30 to 40 seconds. And if that's the case, then having Cataclysm with Channel Demon Fire would allow you to have that burstier damage profile. Or if the adds are, there's only 1 or 2 that spawn consistently, having Havoc and relying more on Chaos Bolts might be the play. But as you progress down, you can then increase the damage of your Rain of Fires, so that your Mastery benefits Rain of Fire, and that Rain of Fire increases the damage of further Rain of Fires. Plus your Blasphemy Infernal option, Blasphemy, or the summoning of your Blasphemy increasing your Immolate damage, which if you're having Fire and Brimstone as a selected choice and your Incinerator hitting everything, it means that every time you summon a Blasphemy, you're going to do increased damage with your Incinerate. So you can have quite a lot of different damage profiles for destruction, which gives us that little bit of flexibility. But for these profiles, to put it into relevancy compared to everything else, you can see that you have, so we'll take the better of the 2 profiles, although it is busier. You have a 60k ceiling and probably what looks to be about a 10k floor. Demonology has 100k ceiling, 25k floor, and Affliction has a 40k ceiling and what probably averages out to a 18-19k floor, but is massively consistent throughout. And obviously fight variants. hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm going to stop this here, and if you want to see how this translates to Mythic Plus, by all means please look at my other video. I appreciate this has been a long one, and I do apologize it's been very maths heavy and graphy with a little bit of Feelycraft and experience thrown in. I will get some more tailored videos out, especially towards pre-patch and how the classes are looking, or specs are looking overall, and I'll just catch you all in the next one. Take care folks, and I hope you all have a lovely day.